My name is Margaret. I'm 70 years old. At Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law handed me a name badge. It read Housekeeper. Her parents laughed. My son smirked and said, "Food's for family." There was no chair for me. I removed my wedding ring, placed it on the table, and said 4 words. The room went silent. Like this video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let me tell you what really happened that night, because what you just heard was only the surface of 43 years of marriage being reduced to nothing more than hired help in my own family's eyes. I want you to picture the scene exactly as it unfolded. The dining room that I had decorated myself 25 years ago, with the mahogany table that Harold and I had saved for months to buy when we were newlyweds. The Christmas china that had been my mother's, the centerpiece I'd spent 3 hours arranging that morning while everyone else slept in. The smell of the turkey I'd been basting since 5 in the morning, the stuffing recipe that had been in my family for 4 generations, the cranberry sauce I'd made from scratch because store-bought wasn't good enough for Christmas dinner. But when I walked into that dining room at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying the last serving dish, there were only 6 chairs around the table. 6 chairs for 7 people. My son David sat at the head of the table where his father used to sit. His wife Jennifer sat to his right, her parents beside her, and their 2 children completing the circle. The conversation stopped when I entered, and that's when Jennifer stood up with that practiced smile of hers, the one she'd perfected over the 8 years she'd been married to my son. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness I almost forgot. She reached into her purse and pulled out a plastic name badge, the kind they use at conferences or corporate events. It was white with black lettering, and as she handed it to me, I could see exactly what it said, Housekeeper. Her parents erupted into laughter immediately. Not polite chuckling, but genuine belly laughs, as if this was the funniest thing they'd ever witnessed. Her mother, Patricia, actually slapped the table and said, "Oh, Jennifer, you're terrible." But she was laughing so hard she could barely get the words out. Her father, Robert, was wiping tears from his eyes and shaking his head like he couldn't believe how clever his daughter was. But it was David's reaction that cut deepest. My son, my only child, the boy I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through colic, stayed up with through every fever and nightmare, driven to soccer practice and piano lessons, helped with homework, celebrated every achievement, comforted through every disappointment. He looked at that badge, looked at me standing there holding it, and he smirked. Actually smirked, like I was in on some joke that everyone understood but me. "Food's for family," he said, not even looking at me directly, cutting into his turkey as if those 4 words explained everything. As if those 4 words justified the fact that there was no chair for me at the table I'd set, for the meal I'd cooked, in the house where I'd lived for 38 years. I stood there holding that name badge and I could hear my heart beating in my ears. The room had gone completely quiet except for the soft clinking of silverware against china as they continued eating. They weren't even pretending to wait for me to figure out where I was supposed to sit. Jennifer had returned to her seat and was cutting her turkey into precise little bites. Her parents were still chuckling softly, sharing knowing looks across the table. The children were focused on their plates, probably confused by the tension, but smart enough to keep eating. I looked around that room, at the family I devoted my entire adult life to, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. It was colder than anger, sharper than hurt. It was clarity. Pure, devastating clarity about exactly where I stood in their world. You see, this hadn't happened overnight. This moment, this humiliation, it had been building for years. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I'd ignored, all the small cruelties I'd accepted, all the ways they'd been slowly erasing me from my own life. It started subtle, the way these things always do. Little comments about how I did things differently than Jennifer would do them. Suggestions that maybe I should take it easy and let the younger generation handle the holiday planning. Conversations that would stop when I entered a room, then resume with forced brightness about topics that somehow never included me. When Harold died 3 years ago, I thought my family would rally around me. Instead, I watched them rally around each other while I became increasingly invisible. David would call Jennifer to discuss family matters instead of calling me. Holiday plans would be made without my input, then presented to me as fait accompli. We thought you'd prefer something low-key this year, Mom. We didn't want to burden you with all the planning. Jennifer's so good at organizing these things. But I accepted it all because I thought it was grief. I thought they were trying to protect me, to give me space to mourn. I thought if I was patient, if I was grateful for whatever inclusion they offered me, things would eventually go back to normal. I thought wrong. The truth is, they'd been positioning me as hired help for months. When I'd arrive at family gatherings, Jennifer would immediately start giving me tasks. Margaret, could you help in the kitchen? Margaret, the kids need their plates cut up. Margaret, we're running low on drinks. Never, Mom, sit down and relax. Never, Mom, let us take care of you. Always Margaret, and always with a job to do. And David never corrected her. Never said, hey, that's my mother, not the catering staff. Never suggested that maybe the woman who'd raised him single-handedly after his father's first heart attack deserved to be treated as an honored guest in her own family. He just let it happen, day after day, gathering after gathering, until apparently even he forgot that I was supposed to be family instead of staff. So standing there in that dining room, holding that humiliating name badge, I finally understood what I'd been too naive or too hopeful to see before. I wasn't family anymore. I was a convenient service provider who happened to live in a house they all assumed would eventually be theirs anyway. I was the woman who cooked their meals and cleaned their messes and babysat their children and asked for nothing in return except basic human dignity. And even that, apparently, was too much to ask. The room stayed silent as I turned that name badge over in my hands. The plastic was cheap, the kind that would leave a mark on your clothes if you wore it too long. The adhesive backing was already peeling at one corner. Even as an insult, it was poorly made. I could feel them all watching me, waiting to see how I'd react. Would I laugh along with the joke? Would I pin it on and play my assigned role? Would I cry and give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd successfully hurt me? Would I argue and prove that I was the dramatic, oversensitive old woman they apparently thought I was? But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I set the name badge down on the sideboard, right next to the crystal water pitcher that had been a wedding gift from Harold's mother. Then I walked to my place at the table, the place that should have had a chair but didn't, and I stood there for a long moment looking down at the empty space. "Where's my chair?" I asked quietly. Jennifer looked up from her plate with those wide, innocent eyes she'd perfected. "Oh, we needed the extra room for Mom and Dad's gifts. We can bring in a kitchen chair if you'd like." A kitchen chair. For Christmas dinner. At the table I'd hosted for 38 years. A kitchen chair like I was a last-minute guest they'd forgotten to plan for, not the woman who'd spent 3 days preparing every single dish they were enjoying. That's when my heart went completely still. Not broken, not racing with anger, just still. Like it had simply stopped beating for a moment while my brain processed the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. This was deliberate. This was their way of telling me exactly what they thought I was worth. And in that moment of perfect, crystalline clarity, I understood something that changed everything. I had been letting them do this to me. Not just tonight, but for months. Years, maybe. I had been so afraid of losing my family that I'd allowed them to reduce me to nothing. I had been so desperate to be needed that I'd accepted being used. I had been so grateful for scraps of their attention that I'd forgotten I deserved a seat at my own table. But here's what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to find out because they'd been too busy planning my humiliation. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't some pathetic old woman with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. I was Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, and I owned things. Important things. Things that made their comfortable little lives possible. See, Harold might have been the one who went to the office every day, but I was the one who managed our finances. I was the one who read every document, questioned every investment, insisted on both our names being on everything that mattered. When he had his first heart attack 15 years ago, I took over completely, and I'd been handling our money ever since. Our money. Not his money that I was lucky enough to benefit from, but our money that I'd earned just as much as he had by keeping his house, raising his son, supporting his career, and being his partner in every way that mattered. The house they were sitting in? Harold and I owned it jointly, and when he died, it became mine. Completely, legally, undeniably mine. The investment accounts they assumed would fund their children's college education? Mine. The life insurance policy they thought would set them up comfortably? The beneficiary was me, not David, because Harold and I had always agreed that the surviving spouse needed security before anyone else got their inheritance. But they didn't know any of this because they'd never asked. They'd never sat down with me after Harold's funeral and said, "Mom, let's talk about finances. Let's make sure you're secure. Let's understand what's going to happen with everything." They'd just assumed. They'd assumed Harold had left them well provided for. They'd assumed I was some helpless widow who'd be grateful for whatever they decided to give me. They'd assumed the house and the money and the security would all flow to them naturally, inevitably, without any input from me required. They were wrong. Standing there in that dining room, I made a decision. Not an emotional decision, not a decision born from hurt feelings or wounded pride, but a clear, rational decision about how I was going to live the rest of my life. I was 70 years old. I could reasonably expect another 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 if I was lucky. And I was not going to spend those years being treated like hired help by people who should have loved me. I walked over to the table and stood behind David's chair. He looked up at me with that same smirk still playing around his mouth, probably expecting me to apologize for causing a scene or to ask permission to go get a kitchen chair so I could join them for the meal I'd prepared. Instead, I reached down and took off my wedding ring. The ring Harold had given me 47 years ago when we got engaged, that had lived on my finger through pregnancy and childbirth and sleepless nights and sick days and celebrations and fights and making up and growing old together. The ring I'd only removed twice in my entire adult life, once to have it cleaned and resized after I lost weight, and once when I'd had surgery and the doctors made me take off all jewelry. I placed that ring in the center of the table, right next to the gravy boat I'd filled 20 minutes earlier. It made a small clicking sound against the wood, barely audible over the Christmas music playing softly in the background. But somehow, that tiny sound commanded everyone's attention. Every face at that table turned toward me. And I said 4 words. 4 words that summarized everything I'd learned about my family in the past 3 years. 4 words that expressed my complete understanding of the situation. 4 words that changed everything. I'm selling the house. The room went completely, absolutely silent. Not just quiet, but silent the way a room gets when everyone stops breathing at the same time. The Christmas music continued playing, some cheerful song about being home for the holidays, but it might as well have been playing in another universe for all the impact it had on the frozen tableau around that table. Jennifer's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, a piece of turkey still speared on the end of it. Her parents looked confused, like they weren't sure they'd heard correctly. The children kept eating, but I could see them glancing up uncertainly at the adults, sensing that something had shifted dramatically but not understanding what. And David. My son David stared at that wedding ring sitting in the middle of his Christmas dinner table like it was a live grenade that might explode at any moment. His face went from smirking confidence to absolute shock in the span of about 3 seconds. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't repeat myself. I didn't explain. I didn't justify or argue or defend my decision. I simply turned around and walked out of that dining room, leaving them all sitting there with their mouths open and their Christmas dinner growing cold and my wedding ring reflecting the candlelight like a small, perfect promise of change. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the master bedroom I'd shared with Harold for 38 years, and I sat down at my dressing table. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, maybe for the first time in months. I saw a 70-year-old woman with silver hair that she'd had professionally styled just that morning. I saw intelligent blue eyes that had read thousands of books and balanced thousands of budgets and watched her son grow from baby to man. I saw hands that had cooked countless meals and changed countless diapers and held her husband's hand as he died and signed all the papers that made her a woman of considerable means. I did not see a housekeeper. I did not see hired help. I did not see someone who deserved to be humiliated in her own home by people she devoted her life to serving. I saw someone who had power. Real power. Financial power. Legal power. The power to change everything with a few phone calls and some signatures on documents that were already prepared and waiting in my attorney's office. You see, I'd been thinking about selling the house for months, ever since David and Jennifer had started making comments about how big it was for just me, how much work it must be to maintain, how much sense it would make for me to downsize to something more manageable. They'd suggested assisted living facilities. They'd talked about condos designed for seniors. They'd even brought me brochures, glossy pamphlets full of smiling old people playing cards and doing water aerobics and pretending to be thrilled about giving up their independence. But what they really meant was that they wanted me out of the house so they could move in. Jennifer had been measuring rooms and taking pictures, just in case. David had been talking about the improvements they could make, the updates they could do, how much space their kids would have to play. They'd been planning their takeover of my home while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. So I'd contacted my attorney, Rebecca Mills, the same woman who'd handled Harold's estate planning and had been our family lawyer for 15 years. I'd asked her what my options were, what I owned, what I could control, what my rights were as a widow and property owner. The conversation had been enlightening. Turns out I owned more than I'd fully appreciated. The house was worth significantly more than Harold, and I had paid for it 38 years ago. The neighborhood had changed, property values had increased, and our 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres was now worth enough to buy 2 or 3 nice condos in the retirement communities David and Jennifer kept suggesting. The investment portfolio was substantial. Harold had been conservative but smart with money, and I'd continued his strategies after his death. Our life insurance policies were considerable. Our retirement accounts were healthy. Add it all together, and I was what Rebecca described as financially independent in any meaningful sense of the term. More importantly, I was under no legal or financial obligation to share any of it with anyone while I was alive. David was my beneficiary for most things, yes, but that was a choice I'd made, not a requirement I was bound by. Beneficiaries could be changed. Wills could be rewritten. Property could be sold and the proceeds used however I chose. Margaret, Rebecca had said during our meeting 2 weeks before Christmas, you don't owe anyone your security or your comfort. You've spent 47 years putting your family first. There's nothing wrong with putting yourself first now. I'd left that meeting with some homework to do. Think about what I really wanted. Think about how I wanted to spend my remaining years. Think about whether the family I devoted my life to actually deserved continued devotion, or whether it was time to stop giving my pearls to swine. Sitting in my bedroom that Christmas night, listening to the muffled sounds of frantic conversation coming from the dining room below, I realized I'd been doing that thinking without quite realizing it. Every time they'd treated me like help instead of family, I'd been thinking. Every time they'd made decisions about my life without consulting me, I'd been thinking. Every time they'd assumed I'd be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way, I'd been thinking. And I'd reached some conclusions. I was not going to spend my remaining years being anyone's unpaid servant. I was not going to live in a house where I was treated like a guest in my own home. I was not going to continue funding a lifestyle for people who couldn't even be bothered to provide me with a chair at Christmas dinner. I was going to sell the house, just like I'd announced. I was going to move somewhere beautiful, somewhere I'd always wanted to live but never could because Harold's business was here, because David's school was here, because everyone else's needs came before my own desires. I was going to find a place where I could be Margaret, not mom or grandmother, or the woman who used to be married to Harold. Just Margaret. And I was going to use my money to do exactly what I wanted to do with it. Travel, maybe. I'd always wanted to see Europe, but we'd never had the time or opportunity. Art classes, perhaps. I'd painted a little when David was young, but had given it up when life got busy. Volunteer work for causes I actually cared about, not just the charity events Jennifer thought were socially appropriate. The phone rang at exactly 7:30, 90 minutes after I'd walked out of that dining room. I let it ring 6 times before I answered, taking my time, letting them wonder if I was even going to speak to them. "Hello," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Mom." It was David, and he sounded rattled. "We need to talk." "About what?" There was a pause, and I could hear Jennifer in the background, her voice sharp with anxiety. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not going according to their plan. About what you said at dinner. About selling the house. What about it? Another pause. Well, I mean, you didn't mean that, right? You're upset, I get that, but you wouldn't actually sell the house. I looked out my bedroom window at the snow-covered yard where David had built snowmen as a child, where Harold had taught him to ride a bike, where we'd hosted countless barbecues and birthday parties and Easter egg hunts. It was a beautiful yard full of memories. But memories don't require you to stay trapped in a place where you're not valued. I meant every word I said. But Mom, this is our family home. This is where Dad lived, where I grew up. You can't just sell it to strangers. Our family home. Interesting how it was our home when he wanted to control it, but somehow I was the one who didn't deserve a chair at the dinner table. It's my home, David. Mine. And I can do whatever I want with it. I heard him take a shaky breath. Okay, look, maybe we handled tonight wrong. Jennifer feels terrible about the name tag thing. It was supposed to be a joke. You know how she is with her sense of humor. A joke. Of course. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. But when they get caught being cruel, it was just a joke. Where are you planning to live if you sell the house? He asked when I didn't respond to his explanation. I haven't decided yet. Somewhere warm, probably. Somewhere I can garden year-round. Maybe Arizona. Maybe Florida. Rebecca thinks I should look at those active adult communities, the ones with golf courses and art studios. Rebecca? His voice cracked slightly on her name. My attorney. We've been discussing my options. The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call might have dropped. Finally, David cleared his throat. Your attorney. You've been planning this. I've been thinking about my future, yes. About what would make me happy in my remaining years. Your remaining years? Mom, you're 70, not 90. You've got plenty of time left. Exactly. Which is why I don't want to waste it being treated like hired help in my own home. I heard Jennifer's voice again in the background, more urgent this time. Then David came back on the line. What would it take for you to reconsider? I mean, if things were different. Things would have to be very different, David. Fundamentally different. And I'm not sure that's possible. What do you mean? I stood up and walked to my window again. I could see down into the dining room from this angle, see the top of the table where my wedding ring was still sitting next to the gravy boat. They'd left it there. In the 90 minutes since I'd walked out, none of them had thought to bring it upstairs to me, or to put it somewhere safe, or to treat it with any kind of respect or significance. It was just sitting there like a piece of discarded jewelry someone had forgotten about. That told me everything I needed to know. I mean that for 38 years, I made this house a home for our family. I cooked thousands of meals, cleaned countless messes, hosted every holiday and birthday and celebration. I supported your father's career, raised his son, and managed his household so he could focus on building the life we all enjoyed. When he died, I continued maintaining this home, continued hosting family gatherings, continued playing my role as the family matriarch. I paused, watching my breath fog the window glass. But tonight I realized that somewhere along the way, you all stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as staff. Tonight I realized that I've been so busy serving everyone else that I forgot I had the right to be served sometimes too. Tonight I realized that I've been giving and giving and giving until there was nothing left of me but the giving. Mom, that's not let me finish. My voice was still calm, but there was steel in it now. Tonight, when there was no chair for me at the table I'd set, when I was handed a name tag calling me a housekeeper, when my own son told me that food was for family, I understood that I'd been demoted from mother to employee without anyone bothering to inform me of the change. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, but he didn't interrupt again. So here's what's going to happen, David. I'm selling this house. The realtor will be here next week to do the assessment. I'll be moving somewhere that makes me happy, somewhere I'm valued for who I am rather than what I can do for other people. The money from the sale will fund my new life, along with all the other assets your father and I worked 47 years to accumulate. What about my inheritance? What about the kids' college funds? What about, I almost laughed at that. Almost. Here I was, telling him I was miserable and unappreciated and planning to rebuild my life, and his first concern was money. His inheritance. Not my happiness, not my well-being, not whether he could do anything to repair the relationship he'd just destroyed. Just money. Your inheritance was never guaranteed, David. It was a gift I planned to give you because I loved you and wanted to provide for your family's future. But gifts can be rescinded when the recipients prove themselves unworthy. Unworthy. His voice climbed higher. Mom, I'm your son. Yes, you are. And tonight you proved that being my son doesn't automatically make you family. Family is about respect, about caring, about making sure the people you love feel valued and appreciated. Tonight you proved that you see me as a convenience, not as a person who deserves your consideration. I heard Jennifer's voice again, sharper now, more demanding. Then David came back on the line. Jennifer wants to talk to you. I'm sure she does. But I don't particularly want to talk to her. She made her feelings about me quite clear tonight. Please, Mom. Just talk to her for a minute. I considered hanging up. I considered turning off my phone and going to bed and dealing with all of this tomorrow when I'd had time to think more clearly. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what Jennifer thought she could possibly say that would fix this. Margaret. Her voice was different now, missing the artificial sweetness she'd used earlier. She sounded genuinely shaken. Yes. I need you to know that the name tag thing was not meant to hurt you. It was supposed to be funny, like a silly Christmas joke. I never intended to make you feel bad. The thing about apologies is that they only work if the person offering them actually understands what they're apologizing for. Jennifer's apology told me she thought the problem was that her joke had accidentally hurt my feelings, not that she deliberately humiliated me in front of her family. She thought the issue was that I was too sensitive, not that she'd been needlessly cruel. Jennifer, did you arrange the seating for dinner tonight? A pause. Well, yes, but did you deliberately not include a chair for me? Another pause, longer this time. We needed room for the gifts, and I thought, did you deliberately not include a chair for me, yes or no? Yes, but I was going to get you a kitchen chair, thank you. That's all I needed to know. I hung up the phone and turned the ringer off. Then I sat down at my dressing table and began making a list of everything I needed to do. Call Rebecca first thing in the morning to start the house sale process. Contact a few realtors to get competitive pricing opinions. Start researching retirement communities in warm climates. Begin sorting through 47 years of accumulated possessions to decide what I wanted to keep and what could be donated or sold. It was a long list, but it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt liberating. For the first time in 3 years, since Harold's death, I had a plan that was about my future rather than my past. I had goals that were about my happiness rather than my obligations. I had a vision of a life that belonged entirely to me. The phone rang again at 8:15, but I let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 8:30 and again at 8:45. By 9 o'clock, it had rung 12 times. I didn't answer any of the calls, but I did listen to the voicemails after they stopped calling. David's voice, increasingly frantic, Mom, please pick up. We need to talk about this rationally. You can't make decisions like this when you're emotional. Jennifer's voice, trying to sound reasonable, Margaret, I think we all just need to take a step back and discuss this calmly tomorrow when everyone's had time to cool off. Her mother's voice, patronizing and condescending, Mrs. Thornton, I'm sure you're upset, but selling your home over a silly misunderstanding seems rather extreme, don't you think? By the 15th voicemail, they'd moved from apologetic to annoyed to angry. David's final message was telling, Mom, you're being ridiculous. One bad evening doesn't justify turning our whole family upside down. Call me back so we can discuss this like adults. Like adults. The irony was breathtaking. They wanted to discuss things like adults after treating me like hired help all evening. They wanted rational conversation after humiliating me in my own home. They wanted me to be reasonable after they'd been anything but. I deleted all the voicemails without responding to any of them. The next morning, I called Rebecca at 9 o'clock sharp and told her to proceed with everything we'd discussed. By 10 o'clock, I had appointments scheduled with 3 different realtors for later in the week. By 11 o'clock, I'd made a list of retirement communities to research, all of them in states where I could garden year-round and where nobody knew me as Harold's widow or David's mother. David arrived at noon, letting himself in with his key like he always did, calling out "Mom" as he walked through the front hall. I was sitting in the living room with my laptop, researching active adult communities in Scottsdale, and I didn't get up to greet him. He found me there and sat down across from me, his face serious and concerned. "We need to talk." "No, we don't. I've made my decision. You can't sell this house, Mom. It's not just your house, it's our family home. It's where your grandchildren come for Christmas and birthdays. It's where all our memories are." I looked at him sitting there in his father's favorite chair, wearing the expression of reasonable concern he'd perfected over the years whenever he needed to convince me to do something I didn't want to do. But today, for the first time, I could see through it. Today I could see that his concern wasn't for me at all. His concern was for himself, for his comfort, for his assumption that he'd inherit this house eventually and wouldn't have to pay for his own family's holiday gathering space. "Whose fault is that, David?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that if this house holds meaningful family memories for you, if it's important to you as a gathering space, then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided I didn't deserve a chair at my own dining room table." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his childhood whenever he'd gotten in trouble and was trying to figure out how to minimize the consequences. "Look, I admit that the whole thing got out of hand last night. Jennifer feels terrible about the name tag, and her parents had no idea you'd be hurt by their laughing. But you have to understand, nobody meant any harm. David, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you broke my favorite vase playing baseball in the house?" He looked confused by the change of subject. "I guess. Do you remember what you told me when I found the pieces hidden under your bed?" "Not really. You said it was an accident, that you didn't mean for it to happen. And I told you that intention doesn't erase impact. That when you hurt someone, accidentally or not, the hurt is still real and you're still responsible for making it right." I closed my laptop and looked directly at him. "Last night wasn't an accident, David. Last night was planned. Jennifer didn't accidentally forget to put out a chair for me. She didn't accidentally have a housekeeper name tag in her purse. Your in-laws didn't accidentally find my humiliation hilarious. And you didn't accidentally decide that I didn't deserve to eat the meal I'd cooked. But we never meant, you meant exactly what happened. You wanted to put me in my place, to make sure I understood my role in this family. You succeeded. I understand perfectly now." He leaned forward, his expression shifting from concern to frustration. "So what, you're going to punish our entire family because you got your feelings hurt?" And there it was. There was the truth underneath all the reasonable concern and apologies. I was the problem for having feelings about being mistreated. I was being punitive for refusing to accept humiliation gracefully. I was destroying the family by insisting on basic dignity. I'm not punishing anyone, David. I'm making choices about my own life with my own resources. If those choices inconvenience you, that's unfortunate, but it's not my primary concern anymore." "Your own resources?" His voice sharpened. "Dad built this life for all of us, not just for you. Your father built this life with me, not for me. I was his partner, not his beneficiary. And now that he's gone, these are my resources to do with as I choose. But what about my kids? What about their inheritance? What about my happiness, David?" I interrupted. "What about my dignity? What about my right to be treated with respect in my own home? When exactly were you planning to consider those things?" He stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. And maybe I had. Maybe the language of self-respect was foreign to a man who'd spent the last 3 years watching his mother be gradually erased from her own family without once stepping in to stop it. "I don't understand what's happened to you," he said finally. "You're not the mother I grew up with." "You're right. The mother you grew up with would have accepted last night's treatment because she was so desperate to keep her family together that she'd accept any scraps of inclusion they offered her. The mother you grew up with would have apologized to you for being upset instead of demanding the apology she deserved. The mother you grew up with would have put everyone else's comfort before her own dignity." I stood up and walked to the window that looked out on the backyard where he'd played as a child. But that mother was tired, David. That mother spent so many years putting everyone else first that she forgot she mattered too. Last night, she finally remembered. "So that's it? You're just going to abandon your family?" I turned back to face him. "I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm reclaiming my life. If you want to be part of it, you're welcome. But it will be on terms that include basic respect and consideration for me as a person, not just as a source of domestic services. What does that mean? It means that if you want a relationship with me going forward, it needs to be a relationship between equals. It means that my time and energy and resources are valuable, and if you want access to them, you need to treat them as valuable. It means that I'm not your unpaid housekeeper or babysitter or event planner. I'm your mother, and I deserve to be treated as such. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to process what I was saying. This was probably the first time in his adult life that someone had told him he couldn't just take what he wanted from them without offering anything meaningful in return. And if we can't do that, then you'll have learned an important lesson about consequences. And I'll have learned an important lesson about who my real family is. He left without saying goodbye, and I watched from the window as he sat in his car in my driveway for nearly 10 minutes, talking on his phone. Probably calling Jennifer, probably trying to figure out their next strategy for managing this crisis I'd created by refusing to accept mistreatment. But I wasn't creating a crisis. I was resolving one that had been building for 3 years. I was finally dealing with a problem that had been festering since Harold's funeral, when my family started treating me like a relic from their past rather than a person with a future. The realtors came that week, all 3 of them, and all 3 of them told me the same thing: my house was worth significantly more than I'd expected. The neighborhood had become increasingly desirable, and my property, with its mature landscaping and updated kitchen and bathrooms, would likely sell quickly at a price that would fund a very comfortable retirement anywhere I chose to live. I listed it with the realtor who seemed most competent and least interested in talking me out of my decision. She understood that this wasn't an impulse sale, that I'd thought it through carefully, that I was excited about my next chapter rather than fleeing from this one. David called every day for 2 weeks, each time with a new argument for why I should reconsider. He offered to buy the house himself until I told him the listing price, and he realized he couldn't afford it. He suggested we could all live together, one big happy family, until I reminded him that the problem wasn't space but respect. He proposed family therapy, which might have been helpful 3 years ago but was far too late now. Jennifer called once, 2 weeks after Christmas, with what she probably thought was a generous offer. She'd talked to her parents, she said, and they all agreed that they'd been insensitive. She wanted to apologize properly and invite me for dinner so we could start over. What would be different about this dinner? I asked. Well, we'd make sure you had a proper place setting, of course. A proper place setting. After 47 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood, after cooking thousands of meals and hosting countless gatherings, after spending my entire adult life putting my family's needs before my own, she thought the problem was the place setting. Jennifer, do you understand why I was upset that night? Because we hurt your feelings with our silly joke. No, because you treated me like hired help instead of like family. But we were just trying to have some fun. Everyone knows your family. Do they? Because from where I was standing, it looked like everyone knew I was convenient domestic labor who could be humiliated for their entertainment. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're really going to sell your house over this? I'm really going to rebuild my life around people who value me. If that doesn't include my son's family, that's disappointing, but it's not going to stop me. The house sold in 6 weeks to a young couple with 2 small children who loved the neighborhood and the schools and the mature trees in the backyard. They reminded me of Harold and me 40 years ago, full of dreams and plans and excitement about building a life together. I was happy to pass the house on to people who would fill it with new love and new memories. I bought a condominium in a retirement community outside Phoenix, a place with mountain views and a golf course and art studios and a library and people my age who were too busy living their lives to worry about whether their adult children approved of their choices. I joined the gardening club and the book club and signed up for watercolor classes and pottery lessons. For the first time since Harold died, I woke up every morning excited about the day ahead instead of dreading the phone calls and obligations and carefully managed family relationships that had been consuming all my energy. David called the day before I moved, one last attempt to change my mind. Mom, please, don't do this. We can work things out. We could have worked things out, David. 3 years ago, when your wife first started treating me like hired help and you said nothing. 2 years ago, when you started making major family decisions without consulting me. Last year, when you told me I should probably start thinking about simplifying my life because keeping up this big house was so much work for someone my age. We could have worked it out at any point if you'd been interested in treating me as an equal instead of as a problem to be managed. I never meant to make you feel that way. I know you didn't mean to. That's part of the problem. You were so comfortable with my diminished role in the family that you didn't even notice it happening. You took my service for granted until it became invisible. You accepted my sacrifices until they became expectations. You got so used to me giving you everything you wanted that you forgot I had the right to want anything for myself. There was a long pause. So this is really goodbye? This is goodbye to the old relationship, yes. The relationship where I gave and gave and gave while you took and took and took. But it doesn't have to be goodbye forever. If you ever decide you want to know me as a person instead of just as a provider of services, if you ever want to treat me as family instead of as staff, my phone number isn't changing. What if we tried harder? What if Jennifer and I made more effort? Then you would have learned something important about valuing people before you lose them instead of after. And maybe you'd build better relationships with your children than you had with your mother. That was 8 months ago. My new life is everything I hoped it would be. I wake up in a beautiful place surrounded by people who enjoy my company because they like me, not because they need something from me. I paint watercolors and grow tomatoes and read books and travel to places Harold and I never had time to visit. I have friends who include me in their plans because they value my presence, not because I'm useful to them. David sends emails now and then, updating me on the kids' activities, sharing family photos, keeping the door open for a relationship that might develop someday if he learns how to see me as more than just his mother. Jennifer doesn't contact me at all, which is perfectly fine with both of us. But here's what I want you to understand, what I want you to take away from this story. I didn't get revenge on my family. I didn't punish them for treating me badly. I didn't take anything away from them that was rightfully theirs. I simply stopped giving them access to things that were rightfully mine. My time, my energy, my resources, my home, my dignity. I stopped allowing people to treat me as less than I was worth. I stopped accepting scraps of attention from people who should have been fighting for the privilege of my company. I reclaimed my life. I remembered that I mattered. I chose to spend my remaining years being valued instead of being used. And if that meant walking away from people who couldn't love me properly, then walking away was the right choice. Because at 70 years old, I finally understood something I should have learned decades earlier. If you let people reduce you to nothing but what you can do for them, they will. Every time. The 4 words I said that Christmas night weren't about revenge or punishment or spite. They were about recognition and reclamation and choice. They were about a woman who had spent 47 years putting everyone else first, finally deciding to put herself first for whatever time she had left. I'm selling the house. For words that changed everything, because they announced that Margaret Elizabeth Thornton was no longer accepting applications for people who wanted to use her. She was only accepting applications for people who wanted to love her. And if that sounds selfish to you, if that sounds like an old woman who couldn't take a joke and decided to hurt her family because her feelings got hurt, then you've missed the point entirely. The point is this: you teach people how to treat you by what you accept. If you accept being treated as hired help, that's what you'll be. If you accept having your contributions taken for granted, they will be. If you accept being reduced to what you can provide instead of being valued for who you are, that reduction will continue until there's nothing left of you but the providing. But if you refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth, if you insist on relationships that honor your full humanity, if you choose dignity over convenience and respect over peace at any price, then you create the possibility of relationships that actually nourish you instead of just depleting you. I spent 3 years trying to earn my place in a family that should have been fighting to keep me. I spent 3 years accepting crumbs from people who should have been offering me feasts. I spent 3 years shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were too small for my worth. But on that Christmas night, when I looked around that dining room and saw no chair for me at the table I'd set, when I was handed a name tag that reduced my 47 years of devoted service to a hired role, when my own son told me that food was for family, I finally understood that I had been trying to earn something that should have been freely given. And I stopped trying. I stopped earning. I stopped accepting. I started requiring. I required respect. I required consideration. I required being treated as family instead of as staff. And when those requirements couldn't be met, I made different choices about where to spend my time and energy and love. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. That's not punishment. That's boundaries. That's not cruelty. That's clarity about what you will and won't accept from people who claim to love you. So like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment where you're watching from, because I want to know that this story reached people who needed to hear it. People who are accepting less than they deserve. People who are giving more than they should. People who have forgotten that they have the right to be valued instead of just used. Your life is not a rehearsal. Your time is not unlimited. Your energy is not renewable. Your love is not inexhaustible. You get to choose how to spend these precious resources, and you get to choose who deserves access to them. Choose wisely. Choose people who see you as family, not as staff. Choose relationships that nourish you, not just relationships that need you. Choose your own dignity over other people's convenience. Because at the end of the day, the only person who can advocate for your worth is you. The only person who can insist on your dignity is you. The only person who can decide you matter is you. I decided I mattered. I decided I deserved better. I decided that my remaining years belonged to me, not to people who couldn't be bothered to provide me with a chair at Christmas dinner. And that decision saved my life. Not because I was dying, but because I was disappearing. I was fading into the background of my own existence, becoming invisible in my own story, accepting a supporting role in a life that should have starred me. Now I'm the star of my own life again. I'm the protagonist of my own story. I'm the one making decisions about where I go and what I do and who I spend my time with. I'm no longer a supporting character in other people's dramas. And that, my friends, makes all the difference. That makes everything worthwhile. That makes every difficult choice, every painful conversation, every moment of uncertainty about whether I was doing the right thing completely worth it. Because I remembered something I'd forgotten. I matter. Not just what I can do for other people, but who I am as a person. I matter. And so do you. Don't forget that. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone reduce you to just what you can provide for them. Don't let anyone treat you as staff when you should be treated as family. You matter. Your dignity matters. Your happiness matters. Your peace matters. Your time matters. Remember that. Fight for that. Require that. And if people can't meet that requirement, then maybe it's time to find people who can. Because life is too short to spend it begging for respect from people who should be offering it freely. Life is too precious to waste it on relationships that diminish you instead of celebrating you. You deserve better. You've always deserved better. And it's never too late to start requiring better. Even at 70 years old. Even after 47 years of marriage. Even after 3 years of accepting less than you deserve. It's never too late to remember that you matter. It's never too late to insist that you matter. It's never too late to build a life that honors the fact that you matter. Take it from someone who learned that lesson almost too late. You matter. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise.